I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. One of the greatest books I ever read early in my career was one called The Wisdom of Teams by a guy named John Katzenbach. And in it, he describes the structure and the behaviors needed to be able to create high-performing teams. He says that high-performing teams are a rare but powerful competitive advantage for those who are able to build and sustain them. He also says that his research points to certain benefits to being able to create these high-performing teams, such as enhanced performance and productivity, increased innovation and problem-solving, greater agility and adaptability, sustained competitive advantage, stronger employee engagement, and of course, satisfaction. Well, my next guest on this particular podcast, Leadovation, is really all about teaming and being able to create these high-performing teams. Much like what John Katzenbach talks about in his book, my next guest has real-world experience when it comes to that secret sauce that takes to be able to create a group of people who are unknown to each other and transform them into a powerhouse of productivity. My next guest is somewhat of a reluctant evangelist when it comes to sharing what he knows about teamwork. And when I asked him, it almost seems like he was forced into getting into podcasts and maybe even one day writing a book, in that his modesty and his work just kept him focused on what he was doing. But people kept coming to him and saying, Bill, you got to tell the world about this. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce a gentleman by the name of Bill Lennan. He has an interesting background. He was raised on islands and had a very diverse educational background. He has always been focused on solving human as well as technological problems. And over the span of his tech career, he has built products, teams, and solutions for mobile, recruiting, e-commerce, social media, and now education. And he has helped many, many companies ranging from Google and Walmart and hotels and restaurants, etc. And building high functioning teams has been the fundamental backbone to Bill's success. And he really has created, I believe, a really powerful, intuitive, and unique recipe for being able to build strong teams. His background is very diverse, and he is currently now the CEO and founder of a company called 40PB, and that stands for 40% Better. Bill Lennan on Leadovation Podcast. Oh, man. Well, Bill, it's great to have you on the show, and I know from your company, 40% Better, that you are an expert on being able to increase the effectiveness and the productivity of teams. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people who are listening to this conversation probably have their ears perked up, because whenever you bring a group of people together, it's obviously around getting something done. And we all know what dysfunction feels like. We all know that there are decisions that are never made. We all know that the lack of psychological safety sometimes prevents communication from happening, hence decisions don't get made. And everything comes to a halt. We've got issues with respect to disruption in our market, with competition, with labor shortages, with an uncertainty with a political year, which we happen to have right now, with AI coming in and shaking things up and all those sort of things. All that being said, Bill, what is the secret sauce, or what is your approach to creating 40% Better for your teams? Because you named your company on that. Mm-hmm. I know that you had found a way to do that, which is why you named your company this. So Walk us through what we can do to get into your head and hopefully take a few ideas so that we can bring it back to our organizations and maybe see some improvements in how our teams are operating.
Sure. Yeah. And you said psychological safety, and that's a huge part of this is creating an environment. I say trust, you say psychological safety. It's all the same thing, where the team really trusts their leadership. And first of all, it's the team lead, because on a day-to-day schedule, the person that has the most impact on the individual contributors in your team is the team lead. That, when you get to the C-suite, I love the C-suite, but they're too insulated away from individual contributors to be able to really on a day-to-day basis get them to improve. And so we're all about helping those team leads really operationalize improving their people. And for us, it's two things. Number one is behavioral. What is it you need to be doing as a team lead every day to help your team get better? And I'm a huge fan of the Japanese Kaizen model. It's just 1% every day. But when you look at 1% every day and compound interest, it's a huge change over the course of a year. And then what are the pillars behind those behaviors to allow you to do them? And part of my discovery when I started reverse engineering this a few years ago was that the 5 pillars that I used weren't standard for most people, which is why I got these results that my peers weren't getting. The first pillar is communication. You have to be able to communicate, first of all, as curiosity, like a lot of curiosity and broad-based curiosity, to really understand what's going on with people on your team as well as across your company. And the second part is you have to learn persuasive communications. And you have to be able to communicate with other people in a way that they understand it, wrapped around their value propositions. And so, this applies to people on your team as well as when you have to go talk with the executives. The second one is emotional resilience. And this is one of those that when I came into team leadership, I had a lot of emotional resilience skills. It's a skill stack. And I didn't recognize how important that was, because I had a belief, one of my mental models is that as a team lead, being emotionally uncomfortable in service of my team is completely okay. And so I regularly did things that scared me, but I saw how doing that would benefit my team. And I've had lots of peers ask me over the years, like, how did you do that? And I'm like, oh, I did this and this and this and this. And they say, I could never do that. And I go, well, why not? Like,
Could you give us an example, Bill? I mean, I love the thought about emotional resilience.
Sure.
Theoretically, I get it, but could you put us through a scenario where
certainly happy to
emotional resilience would take place, and how do you facilitate that in others or in yourself?
Yeah. So I'll answer the last question first. Emotional resilience is actually a well-documented set of skills. And there's a clinical mental health practice called dialectical behavior therapy. And it's all about all the ways to manage your own brain chemistry. There's 50 plus skills in the stack. I got lucky that in my childhood, I managed to learn about 40 of them organically. So, I got very, very lucky. But anybody can learn them, right? I mean, they're highly transferable skills. An example, early in my career, I used to have really, really bad social anxiety. Like, I was super shy, introverted, afraid to talk to people, everything. I realized that was going to be a real problem in my career. And so I decided I had to get over it somehow. And I came up with a recipe with the help of a friend of mine to start talking with strangers. And we broke down my fear into like the smallest pieces we could. And the starting point was asking the barista at Starbucks how their day was going, which sounds ridiculously easy, but I was terrified when I started doing it because I was so emotionally uncomfortable. I was able to pull it off because I had the breath control techniques, I had the values and priorities, and I had the willingness to stay mindful and calm in the moment and do the first, how's your day going, with a barista. And then to come back the next day and do it again. And then to come back the next day and do it again. And each time I did it, it got a little bit easier. And after 2 weeks, it was super easy. And I was like, okay, what's the next step? I have used that same model with getting over my fear of presentations, getting over my fear of public speaking, pitching executives for funding for things that would help my team, going and talking to other people in other parts of the company about things. It's
So if you were to use the example, sorry for interrupting, but
yeah.
if you were to use the example you just gave about the barista at Starbucks, I would then think, okay, so what Bill is saying to me is that if I am trying to build emotional resilience, I should find some processes, be it small, like what you just described,
Yep.
that lean into the place in which I have discomfort.
Yes, definitely.
For example, if
Yep.
I'm afraid of public speaking, if I'm afraid of having a crucial conversation, if I'm afraid of speaking up to my boss, if I'm afraid of admitting, I just had this conversation today with an executive, admitting my own mistakes, because
Mm-hmm.
I thought that maybe I should be a person who should be the source of answers. Oh, so now I'm going to lead into the fear of being seen as being a failure. I'm going to admit my mistakes more often than maybe I would have before. So this is sort of what I'm sensing is your process in
Yeah.
this one area, this number 2, I guess it is, on your
Yeah.
list of items, the
Yeah.
emotional
Yeah.
resilience piece. Okay.
Yeah. And it's also,
I'm tracking.
yeah, it's also like I like to operate in flow. And I notice when I'm falling out of flow, okay, that's a brain chemistry thing. Now I need to go do something to figure out what's going on, right? Oh, I've been in flow for 45 minutes and that's kind of, I maxed myself out. I need to get out of there and go do something different and then come back. And so it's leveraging it broadly, right? Knowing how to do a lot of things skill wise to manage my brain chemistry so that I can step into places that might be emotionally uncomfortable and have a good outcome, right? And making the fear not a mystery anymore. Because what I heard from a lot of people, my peers, was all they knew was if I was afraid, that's the wall, right? And for me, the fact that I was afraid just meant I had to break it down into a small enough piece that I could take it on, right?
Yeah.
So, when I would go talk to execs about things like, I wanted something for my team, I figured out how to make it as structured to their benefit as possible, right? So back to communication. One of the ways that I reduced my fears was getting better at persuasion so that I could talk to the execs and say, here, my team needs funding for this thing, but I'm putting it in their success metrics, right?
Yes, right.
You want us to be faster. What we've figured out is that the ROI of this investment for you is 3 months. So even though I'm emotionally scared, I know I've got a persuasive argument, right? And I can step into that place of fear and have that conversation.
Okay, so let's take a quick pause here because I want to call out a couple of things here before I lose them in my head. One is you'd mentioned this phrase called flow, and I wanted to just call that out a second because it sounds like that is the desired state for us to be in, based on how you set this up. And I would also agree with you on that. How does one know? I mean, if that's sort of the promised land here is for the individual to be in a state of flow. And of course, there's a lot of books on it. I've got a few myself, and maybe somebody out there knows how to pronounce the name of the guy who wrote the book called Flow. I think his name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi or something or rather. But
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Thank you. See, I had it wrong, but it's a great name. But nonetheless, what does flow feel like, Bill?
Flow feels like I'm very focused on one thing. Time kind of goes away. The process of the work or whatever it is I'm doing is really easy. I have no distraction.
Ergo, if we are to be a team who is going to get 40% better results, for example, are we also going to assume that team is going to be experiencing greater amount of time in the state called flow? Are they aligned?
That is a side benefit.
Okay.
Yeah. The thing that and this is a great question, by the way. Thank you. I appreciate this.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. The starting point is I'm trying to figure out, and I probably should have said this to begin with. I'm trying to figure out what all the frictions are for the team and get that out of the way first. Right. And so the whole reason behind everything I'm doing is to figure out why is there friction and what can I do to either remove it or lubricate it, one of the two. And so and this is a mental model, right? So the third pillar is mental models. And I have found that a lot of people have self-limiting mental models or beliefs. And I always try to go look for self-empowering beliefs. And so an example of that would be, I talk with team leads and I'm like, they tell me about a problem. I'm like, well, why don't you go look at solving it? And they go, it's above my pay grade. And I think, wow, that is not my mental model. My mental model is if I see a problem and I think my team can figure out how to solve it, we should take a look at it. I should talk to whoever and say, hey, I see this problem. I think we should go solve it. Get my boss's approval, do it as a side project, whatever, and then go after it. That approach has, number one, allowed my teams to solve all kinds of problems that are outside of their core competence, their core area of responsibility. But it's also helped the companies that I've been at where they had struggles and nobody else was stepping up to go solve the problem.
Yes. It's a great point because I think what you're onto is really, really important. Again, I don't mean to be throwing out names of people, but there's this great book that I remember reading a while back called The Wisdom of Teams by a guy named John Katzenbach out of Harvard. Yeah. And you read his research and it's not just fluff. It's not just some guy with a Mai Tai, somewhere in Maui coming up with these ideas. He's got real practical, real world experience and data to support it, much like what you do. And he's basically saying the engine of a great company are great teams.
Yeah.
And we really need to be thinking and focusing on that. And it also reminds me of something else I saw regarding how change gets done in organizations. And if it's an economic change, we need to make cost cutting. We need to reorganize the actual structure of an organization. Those sort of economic changes are very much appropriate from a top-down approach. C-suite comes together, we see the writing on the wall, we need to make some changes, we implement those changes. Because of the perch in which they sit, they see things that the rest of the organization cannot see. Environmental scans, what the market looks like, what the trends are, that makes sense. But what I found is that most organizations apply that same model for changing things within companies with everything else. Like it's a top-down approach. Instead of when it comes to culture, when it comes to productivity, what this other body of research seems to be saying is it's bottom up. You take 100%. It from the perspective of where does the work take place and empower those people to make those decisions that they can make because they are closest to whatever, the customer, the product, the service. And I just find it fascinating that we often find ourselves trying to affect change within teams, not by the teams themselves,
right,
but those who are above those teams who don't necessarily have line of sight to what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's 100%. Yeah, it's not completely.
Well, so what is the? I mean, all right. So I want to get to your other. I think you've got 5 people. So before you get to the third one, you had mentioned something a minute ago, Bill, about being able to influence, for example, your boss by creating a success metric that they value, and so therefore you present it to serve them as well as you. And I 100% agree. I have to, though, wonder, there must be somebody out there who's driving on the way home from work and listening to this conversation and go, what if, Bill, what I need is not necessarily what my boss needs? How do we bridge the gap when we have, like, my team needs this, say it's, right now it's labor. It could be a new technology in order to be successful. And management says, we can't afford it.
Right.
How do we bridge that gap, or how do we resolve for that, which to the team leader is saying, but that is a friction and you want to lubricate or you want to remove the problem. How do we remove problems whereby the team doesn't have the resources to do so?
Right. No, that's a great question. And so when we're talking about persuasion, what we're doing is, first of all, we're figuring out what are the success metrics of our boss or whoever is the decision maker, right? I got to get the CTO to approve funding to buy new computers for my whole team, right? And everybody in the team has gone and asked for computers and they've been told no. So the thing to figure out there is, what is the benefit in terms of man hours of time that the new computers will provide? How is that going to improve our productivity? And how can I take a financial argument to the CTO and say, look, this might look expensive, but here's the real. The ROI on this is 3 months, because we're going to save so many man hours per developer, per day, per week, per month. Here's the math, right? If you've got something that, like everything that we want for our teams, arguably there is a business reason behind it that's going to save money, right? In the long run, right? And so you have to be able to look at it and go, okay, and I'm all about stacking up data so that my argument is ridiculously powerful. Like I'm not worried. I'm not thinking about going into this persuasion conversation and having it be anything other than I've got all the data and they have to say yes, or they're going to say something that I never considered before, right? And I get to learn from that.
And could you not go into that conversation with your boss fully aware that we have financial constraints and that what I'm going to ask is going to be returned with a no, because I've got enough understanding of what my boss is going through, and we know we can't afford 4 new FTEs, and maybe we can only afford 1.
Yeah. So what happens is, and this is, so I was at a company, and this is what happened. I went in and I said, hey, the whole team is complaining their computers are slow. I like to get new computers. And he said, we can't afford it. Exactly the use case you're talking about. He said, we can't afford to buy new computers. And I said, oh, it's a financial problem. Okay, got it. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so I went back to the team and I said, okay, we need to do some benchmarks. How much time is it taking our current computers to compile our stuff? And can we get a brand new computer from anywhere, or a close to new computer that we can use as a comparison, right? And I got the data, right? Because one of the guys, his wife had a brand new computer, and we did our compilation on that, saw the time difference. And then I said, okay, how many times a day do you run a compilation? It's simple multiplication, right? And then how many people on the team? And then how many times do we do this every day, week, month? And then how much does a software engineer cost per hour? Fully loaded, right? So now I've got the math to go back, and I can go back and go, hey, and I did. I went back to that. I've got some new data. I think this will change your perspective. Here's what it looks like. And I laid everything out for him, and he could not get me the computers fast enough, because he realized, oh my God, we've got this slow bleed of wasted person hours, and they're not cheap person hours, right? Fully loaded software engineers are 100 and some odd dollars an hour, right? That starts to stack up pretty fast.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, the math in front of him wasn't the cost of the computers. It's, I got to stop this bleed, right? We're bleeding money because these guys can't be productive. And that's an expensive problem. And once I said, look, here's the ROI. You're paid back in 3 months. He was like, oh, well, okay. I had no idea. And literally first thing the next morning, I got a stack of brand new computers.
This is great. I love where your mind is taking us in this. I don't think most of us put this sort of planning into our requests of management.
Thank you.
And if we did the way you're describing, we probably would be a lot more successful. Let me throw another wrench into this, because this is really getting me thinking here, Bill. What about if it's it's an emotional barrier, meaning my CEO has a hard time with conflict, and yet I know that he needs to hold somebody accountable, and my request is for him or her to do that, and by not doing it, it's really hurting my team, our productivity. So now I could probably come up with, by not taking care of this dysfunctional person on my team, we could all have a lot of data to support why that's difficult, but the CEO is still shaking in his or her boots to be able to have to pull the trigger on somebody.
Sure.
Is the data enough to overcome emotional triggers?
So I try to solve those problems myself. And at most, I get the CEO to say yes to me solving the problem.
Meaning,
Right?
like, although it's my job as CEO to, let's just take this example, right?
Yeah.
It's my job to fire this person,
Yep.
but I'm going to let you, Bill, do it.
Yeah.
Even though, Bill, you are not a peer of this person that needs to be fired. In fact, you're subordinate to them.
So I haven't done that one yet.
This is maybe, but
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I know this is
Yeah.
I'm going kind of nuts on this example,
Yeah.
but this happens all the
Right.
time.
Right. So the first thing I would do is, if I see that there's some kind of conflict in the company, I'm going to try and figure out that person's motivators and what drives them and how I can bend them to be an ally of my team and not a friction.
Okay.
Right? Like that's my first thing is how do I figure out how to get inside their head? And this is why the first part of communication is all about being curious. Like I'm going to go sit with them and spend time with them and talk with them and figure out how to make that change happen. Right? Because I would rather have allies than enemies.
Yeah.
Right? And I'd rather have more allies inside the companies than enemies. And so I'm going to try and bend their head. Right? If they're absolutely not, like they just don't want to do it, right? Then my argument with whoever the final decision maker is going to be, look, so-and-so's here. I know you don't like conflict. I get it. And I probably wouldn't use exactly those words, but that's the idea. This is all the data for why it's a problem that they're still here, right? Before I get to that, I'm probably going to try and figure out how to get that person moved someplace also voluntarily of their own accord. Like I want them to see a doorway and go, wait a minute, I want to go through that door and do that other thing. I fully admit to being Machiavellian about this, completely admit it. But I want to set them up for success that's not messing up my team.
Right. Good.
And so if I can, I'm going to do that, right? CEO doesn't have to be involved at all unless it's just sign the paper to let them have a transfer, right? If
Which
I really have...
Yeah, which might push your own buttons, which goes back to your number 2 item about being emotionally resilient.
Right. Yeah.
So you may have to lean into something, because I think a lot of people may go, yeah, that sounds good, but I'm too afraid to do that. I mean, or I don't like this person, or I'm avoiding them more than anything versus leaning into them and try to make them successful, whatever. This is great. So Bill, what's number 3 and you had 5, right?
Yeah. So the third one is mental models, right? It's the ways that I look at all these things to be empowering rather than disempowered, right? And there's a dozen mental models that I use that I find that most other people don't, right? The first one is that my job is to help my team improve their performance. Like that's just foundational, right? That even if it's not explicitly written in my job description, that my number one responsibility as a team lead is to help the team operate better, right? And that's I'm going to remove friction or I'm going to lubricate it, one of the two.
So
right?
it's a mindset, it's a paradigm,
totally
it's
mindset.
a guiding principle.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And the second one is I might have to be emotionally uncomfortable in the process, and that's okay, right? That's the game, right? So the third one is mental models. The fourth one is power dynamics. And that is all about where and how and who power exists inside a company, and how anybody at any place in the company can actually have the power to make change happen inside an organization. And
what's the application of that, though?
So I've gotten CEOs, I've gotten companies to change business processes. I've gotten them to go after completely new business markets. I've I've gotten them to launch completely new products that they didn't have on their radar before. I've gotten stuff for my teams. It's
But you mentioned power dynamics.
yeah. So what
Were you able to figure out, I'm filling in the blanks as I'm thinking here, who's got the power to be able to bring about what I'm looking for,
right.
and create the relationship, the partnership that way? Is that, in a sense, the end of the sentence?
So that's a piece of it. The other part is knowing that no matter where I am in the organization, I have the ability to go talk to anybody in the company, learn whatever it is that's there that I need to understand to go solve a problem. Right. And that I shouldn't, like, nothing's above my pay grade. Right. If there's something that's going on that is, so I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was at a company had been around for 20 years. The CEO, the industry had changed a bit. The CEO was still using language from when the industry was brand new. Nobody currently today was using that language anymore. It was still technically 100% valid, but most people hadn't been around in the industry since 20 years ago. And so him using language that nobody understood meant his credibility was horrible. Right? And I knew he was working on a book. And every time he spoke publicly, he used outdated language. And so it was really bugging me. And I'm like, okay, how come nobody tells him? And so I started asking people, like we all know that nobody says that except for him. What's the deal? How come nobody will? And everybody said some version of, nobody has the nerve to go talk to the CEO and tell him his language is outdated. And I said, oh, okay, it's an emotional resilience problem, right? It's not that I'm the only one that sees the data. It's that they don't have the emotional resilience, and they don't know how to get him to actually change his mind. And so I thought about it for a while, and I created a pitch for him where I outlined what his peers and people he respected in the industry, the language they were using versus the language he was using. And I got on his calendar, said, I need 15 minutes. I want to talk with you, and I think it'll be helpful, especially because you're working on a book. And he said, yeah, sure, no problem. And I went in and I walked through my perspective, and he said, I had no idea. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And he walked out of that meeting and did a presentation that totally changed all his language.
So, Bill, this is great. So did you actually take the approach? Again, I'm seeing the emotional resilience plus the power dynamics. You kind of bringing those two concepts together. And did you align your feedback to the book, or did you align your feedback to the fact that there were people who felt his credibility was diminishing because he was using outdated language, or both?
So the book was kind of the focal point, but I talked about how his peers and people he respected, the language they used, right? And I talked about credibility, and I laid out the data point that today across this industry, almost nobody has been in the industry for more than 5 years, except for you and a couple of other people, right? And so the people that you want to impress have all been in the industry 5 years or less. And so even though the language you're using is technically accurate, people don't understand it. And because it's not the language they're using today. And so they're going to discount everything you say because they don't understand the context, right? And worst case scenario, they think you're talking about something totally different.
Right. So again, what you're saying is, though, even though the context in the beginning was about this book that you just referenced, because a lot of us out there are going to say, well, my CEO's not writing a book, so I don't have that as an option. But I do need to. What's that?
He is doing public speaking, or she's doing public speaking. Yeah.
Well, again, this is so interesting. I just talked to this guy yesterday, and we were having almost the exact same conversation that you and I are having in this scenario.
Yeah.
And he was reticent about giving, in a sense, a senior person some feedback. And I was trying to work with him about the approach and how to do that, and how the feedback actually was a gift, and that was something that would be helpful. And that, if we really want to create a learning culture and environment, we can't enable our own tendencies to withhold information, that in a sense we're
100%.
in cahoots with this dynamics that we somehow rail against. So therefore we have to get a little emotionally resilient and do so in a way that's respectful, right? You know, they don't want to trigger anybody else, right?
Right.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, what's the fifth one?
So the fifth one is habits. And so this is really the focusing on the behaviors of what are you going to do on a day-to-day basis, right? And so one of the foundational things is I do 15-minute one-on-ones with everybody on my team every week just for them to complain to me. Like I just listen to their complaints. I don't care what they have to complain about. It could be that the network is slow. It could be they don't like some teacher at their kid's school. I really don't care.
Oh, it doesn't have to be work related?
Anything at all. That's right. Here's why. There's two parts to this. The first thing is they get it off their chest, right?
Oh.
And part of the value of therapy is just going and going blah, 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 blah about whatever it is bugging you, right? There's a catharsis in that. And then you can go think about other things. And I want them thinking about work, and that one-on-one gets them to dump out their friction. And now...
That's a great idea.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
No, that's a great idea. I've done an exercise that's not exactly like this at the beginning of a meeting. And I would give people, I found this from somebody else. And the idea would be, okay, everybody pull out a piece of paper and a pencil, and I want you to write down for like 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes at the most, all the things that you're thinking about, all the concerns you have that are keeping you from being present in flow, back to your word again, in this meeting. And so now they just dump. You know, they're worried about their kids. They've got this situation with their car. You know, they're thinking about these items they have to finish by tomorrow because there's a board meeting. You know, they get it all out.
Yep.
And like, okay, now that you've done that, can we all be here now?
Right.
And usually we find a different result.
Yeah.
But it's really because I could see the people would say like, well, Bill, gosh, you know, I certainly want to be able to know where they're having struggles at work, but am I crossing some sort of line when it comes to asking them to bitch about what's going on at work or at home? I mean, with my kids, my wife, my family. Yeah. I mean, is that appropriate? Am I going to run into some HR issues here?
So I don't ask them about what's going on at home explicitly. I just wait for them to tell me whatever's going on. Right?
Okay.
Like it's all voluntary. Like I'm like, hey, what's going on? Talk to me about friction. Right. And usually the first 2, 3, 5 weeks, it's all work related, right? We've got this process that is just really annoying. How come they didn't catch this bug in QA? Why do we have to do code releases? Like whatever, right? Bill, you're not writing good enough notes when you're putting stories into our backlog, right? Okay, like awesome, right? I want to hear all those complaints. I want to document them all. I want to figure out the ones that are common across the group. And then I want to get rid of them, right? Because if everybody's complaining that I'm not writing enough detail, then I need to fix that problem, right? Like that's my problem. I need to be like, geez, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to put a lot more detail in, and then everybody gets to review it before we do anything with it, right? Whatever the problem happens to be. But I want to start working down that list of problems. And, you know, if it's something like, literally, one of my teams, someone complained that their kid was struggling with math and that they were spending a lot of time helping their kid with math. And I said, well, you know, I don't know if this is going to help you at all, but both of my sons struggled with math at different ages. And I sent them to this particular math tutor, and they both loved it. They loved their math. Their homework got done. They turned into straight A students with math. And just the idea that that was possible completely changed the whole outcome for this kid, because the parent was like, oh my God, I never thought about that. And they ended up going to the same tutor. And now there's a piece of friction I've taken out of their life, right? They get to have an easier life, and it doesn't matter what it is, right? I really, like, if I have any way to provide any input to help them with that friction, in the long run, back to your original point at the beginning, this is a way to build psychological safety and trust with the team, is I'm taking care of their problems, right? Like, that's my job.
Yeah. Right.
is
Right.
is to get that. And so, if it's stuff at work, great. I'm going to go address it. I'm going to go figure it out. Like, I don't care what it is. I'm going to go figure out how to handle it. And if it's on the personal side, any way, shape, or form that I can point something in their direction, I'm going to do it.
I think one of the other side ancillary things that happen, I believe, in what you're talking about, Bill, is around creating a learning culture.
Oh yeah,
that allows people to share what their frictions are, and then by so doing, we're getting one step closer to being able to solve for them, learn from them, and so that we don't keep repeating the same thing over and over again. But we can't even start that process until we start talking about it. There's for those of you who are curious about another resource, there's a great researcher, thought leader named Amy Edmondson, who's out of Harvard, and she's got a lot of great work and books on this very topic around creating learning cultures. So the other last question I want to have to send you is, I really do think that's a brilliant idea, and a new idea, actually, that I've not thought of before. I love it. Is there a danger that we are beginning to then train people to think only about the problems and not about the solutions? Because sometimes what we hear, managers rail against this all the time. Yeah, I got people coming into my office and all they do is complain, which was in a simple, another way of saying your meetings is a way to complain, is a way to get it off their chest. 100%. And it's great. But are we not also trying to teach people to be able to say, here's my concern, here's my issue, here's the friction, and I've thought about what the solution might be, and AKA boss, I'm coming into the meeting with both. Here's the complaint, and this is my idea, my point of view about how we might solve for that. And I keep hearing managers want both, but what's your sense?
So part of the reason managers want both is because they're afraid to go solve the problem for somebody. Like, sorry, that's just the reality, right? For whatever reason, they're like, that's above my pay grade or whatever. It's too emotionally uncomfortable. I'm not going to go look at that. I don't want to go do that, right? So
I'm too busy to do it.
Right. But the thing is, here's the question, right? If your prime responsibility is helping your team operate better, and by solving this problem for somebody on your team, you're going to help them operate better. You too busy should never, like, you're missing the point, right? Like, that's my whole thing is, okay, if I do this, the team will operate better, right? They're going to trust me more. And every time I build more trust in the team, I get greater productivity. Like, it just keeps happening, right?
Yeah.
And so, and for me, that's what the game is all about, is getting better productivity. And so for me, I always have time because I know that investment is going to give me a gigantic ROI on the back end. And so what I find over time is that their problem solving ability gets better. And I don't understand why, but if we're talking and they come in with a complaint and we're talking and I'm like, oh, well, like, here's 3 different ways we could probably solve this problem. Which of them makes sense, right? Which one do you think is the best? They're like, oh. And then over time, what I find is that they come in with solutions, or they don't have any, like, after a year, people are like, okay, my problems are all gone, right? Except for this one that Bill can't touch, right? And okay, great, And so then when they come in, they're like, okay, here's a problem. I don't know what to do. What do you think? I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about it. They come in oftentimes with solutions over time as they trust me and they're willing to be vulnerable and say, I've got this problem. We have this problem. I think this might solve it, but I'm not really sure. What do you think?
It's a really good point, because I do think what I'm sensing is that a person may not come to you or me or anybody else with a problem if they feel like they have to come with a solution as well.
Right,
like,
right.
Bill, I get it. I know you want me to come to your office with a solution to back up my problem, but the problem is I don't even know what the solution is.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I'm too wrapped up in it. I'm too emotionally distraught. I'm too upset. I can't even think straight. Yeah. I just need to get it off my chest. And then maybe we can have that conversation to talk about solutions. So I think your point's really well taken.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah. I have to show how much I care about them first.
Very good. Bill, I could talk with you all day.
Yeah, thank you.
What are you doing for dinner?
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this. This is really great. But I have to ask, how can people learn more about you?
Sure.
You're a delightful guy, by the way.
Thank
Those of you who haven't seen his face, he's just full of wonderful energy. He really is.
Thank you.
And you got some great ideas. How can people follow what you're about?
So I'm on LinkedIn, WB Lennan. My bald head's there on my picture, so it's pretty easy to figure out who I am. You can email me. My email is bill@40pb.com, number 4, number 0, letter P, letter B.com. I got lucky and got a 4-character domain.
Yeah.
And then that's the easiest ways to get hold of me. I put a lot of content up on TikTok. About, and on TikTok, I'm Bill Lennan with 3 L's in the middle. And, and we have a podcast. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Your own podcast.
I started doing my own podcast. I'm like 20 some odd episodes in now.
What's it called?
It is called 40% Better.
You had to think about that, didn't you?
Yeah.
That's great. And are you writing a book?
I am not, but you're like the 30th person who's asked me to write a book.
Well, it just seems like you've got the content here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we could talk offline about that, but there's a lot of interesting things. You've got the chapters already lined out. You've got chapter 1, curiosity and communication. Number 2 is around emotional resilience. Number 3 is around mental models. Number 4 is around power dynamics. Number 5 is around habits. Conclusion, stories, done.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the foundation, and then it's what are the behaviors you should be doing on a regular basis, right? You're doing the one-on-ones. Mm-hmm. I didn't even get the part. So another part is going out and talking to people inside the company. Like as a team lead, you should be the scout for your team and go out and talk with people in the company, because there's 2 things that teams need. Number 1, visibility. And if you're not talking to people, they don't know you exist, right?
Right.
And when you're talking to people and you're learning about their problems, then you can solve those problems for them.
Yes.
Right. And that's been a catalyst for my career freedom and my teams getting better projects. Because all of a sudden people are like, oh, well, Bill comes and talks to us about stuff. He keeps solving problems. His team should work on this.
Yes.
Right. And that just by the act of being out there and talking with people, it gets us better stuff to work on.
You're the ambassador for your team.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
That's a very good way of putting that.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, it's been really great to meet you.
Thank you.
Really, I hope that our paths cross again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Leadervation with Dean Newland. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com, or check the show notes. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. Transform your leadership success with Leadervation.